So at this point, I'm starting to become fairly familiar with the Cinema 4D, the simple interface that's being presented in the perspective viewport. At this point, I can click and hold on this cube menu, which reveals more parametric primitives, and I can introduce additional objects. I know that if I roll my mouse over one of the axes, I can click and drag and move that object according to one of the axes. If I hit the delete key, I'll delete objects that are selected. I can use the object manager over here to select different objects. Now, once I have an object selected, I want to draw your attention down here to the attributes manager. And by default, in the attributes manager, when you have an object selected, you'll be looking at the object tab. Now, the object tab has some important information in it. It has information that governs the size of these objects that we have selected. In this case, I have the cube selected, and therefore I can control the size of the x dimension. Okay, and so in that case, it'd be kind of like the width of this cube. I can control the y dimension, which would be the height of the cube, or the z dimension, which is the depth of the cube. And I can influence these numbers a couple of different ways. I could just simply highlight that value, and I could type in 400 and hit return. And when I do that, you can see that my cube gets twice as wide. I could also use these arrow keys, or these arrow buttons over here, and just click and individually reduce the size of that and get, very precise control over clicking on the down arrow or clicking on the up arrow. In addition to that, I can also click and drag up and down and very dynamically increase or decrease the size of that parametric primitive according to this, in this case, the x dimension. Okay, and I'll just key in that value back to 200, back to its default value. So I can highlight this value here and type in a different number. I can also click on these up and down arrows, or I can click and drag on the up and down arrows, or if I have a mouse with a wheel on it, I can actually just click inside this field and roll my mouse up or down. So I have lots of different ways to control the dimension of this object. In addition to that, you might have noticed these little control points that pop up that are restricting to these individual axes. So I'm looking at these orange dots that show up in line with each of these axes. If I roll my mouse over this control point, you'll see that it highlights, it turns from orange to white. And if I click and drag on that, that's a real quick way to dynamically increase or decrease this size. So at this point, I'm playing around with the cube and the cube dimension, and you'll notice that if I go into the sphere, I have different parameters that govern the size of the sphere. The cube is it has three dimensions according to its x, y, and z. The sphere, because it has symmetry to it, we're just basically going to influence the radius of this object. And I can do it the same way. Click and drag on the arrow down, up, and I can really quickly and dynamically change the size of this object. So I'm playing around with the values. When I click on the cone object, you'll see that I have a lot more parameters that I can govern. It has a top radius, okay, which is causing the point of the cone. We have a bottom radius, which is the bottom radius of the cone. And then, of course, we have the height, which will govern the overall height. Now, I got a little bit of a glitch in my scene here. I'm starting to build a scene, just some basic parametric primitives, and I can't see the top of my viewport. And this is pretty typical. You'll get into the situation. There's a couple of different things that we can do. We can navigate the viewport, and this is really where the magic of 3D building or illustrating or designing in a 3D space, this is really where the magic happens. Inside a 3D space, we have the ability we could pan around this space. And now I'll share with you a couple different ways to navigate. If I look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that I have a couple of different icons here, and I'll start with this outside icon, the one farthest from the left. If I click and hold on this, now it's not a toggle button, I'm not clicking on it and then trying to drag in the scene. You'll see what happens when I do. What I'm doing is I'm clicking and I'm holding the mouse and I'm dragging around. This is the pan. So I'm panning inside my 3D viewport. The next icon over is the dolly icon. And if I click and drag left or right, I'm zooming in and out. The third one is where things get really fun. This is the orbit view. And if I click and drag, you can see that I'm orbiting around my 3D scene. Okay, so I click and drag. I have the pan. So I'm panning left or right, up or down. I have zoom or dolly, I'm dragging left and right and I'm zooming in and out. And then I have orbit, which is actually changing my perspective. Now, there are some quick keys that allow us to navigate the scene just the same, and in fact I'm going to start using the quick keys. I happen to have a mouse with a mouse wheel, and I can roll in and out with my mouse. So as I roll in, I'm zooming in, and as I roll out, I'm zooming out. That's with the mouse wheel. If I want to pan, this is slightly more complicated than just zooming in. I'm holding down the number 1 key on the keyboard, and I'm clicking and dragging. Okay, so this is the number 1 key, the key that's just above the Q key on the keyboard. I'm dragging and I'm panning. If I hold down number 1, I pan. If I hold down number 2 and drag left and right, I'm dollying. And yep, that's right. If I hold down number 3, I'm going to orbit. Okay. Now what I like doing is I like using the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. If I hold down the Option key on the keyboard, the key on a Mac is just to the left of, or the right, just on the outside of Command. I'll hold down the Option, and I'll click and drag. I can orbit. So I can mouse wheel in, I can Option click to orbit, and I can number 1 click to pan. And those are the quick keys that I'm going to use to navigate my 3D space. Now, once you start navigating the 3D space, it's going to be really easy to get disoriented. So I'm looking completely upside down, I'll pan over here, and I'm just like completely out of whack. Whenever you're orbiting a scene, you always want to try to get back to a default view. And our default view, roughly, in Cinema 4D, is more or less this view here. And what I mean by that is the Z, or the foreground background axis, the blue axis, is running more or less in the foreground background. Our X is running more or less to the left and right, and I can even flatten this view out to see this a little bit more dramatically. Our X, our red axis, is running left and right, and our Y, or green axis, is running up and down. So whenever you kind of flip around and get completely lost and turned around, always try to get back to that default view. And so I'll just orbit by clicking with the Option key down, and I'll just orbit back until I get reoriented. And if you look down here in the bottom left-hand corner, as I orbit in the 3D space, you can see that this little heads-up display changes to remind us what direction we're looking in. And also we can look at, for now, we can look at the object axes to give us a sense of our direction as well. So take a few minutes and start to understand how to navigate this 3D space. It's okay if this feels clumsy and clunky and awkward for now. With a little bit of experience, this will start to become second nature. So play around with your scene. Try to create a cube, a sphere, and a cone, and stack those objects on top of each other. You can confirm that those objects are exactly on top of each other by selecting each object and looking in the position coordinates and making sure that the only coordinate that changes for each one of these objects is the Y, okay? That's the up-down axis. So I know that these objects are exactly aligned according to X and according to Z. The only way that they move is along the Y-axis. And just experiment with creating a couple different shapes, stack them on top of each other, try to navigate the scene, and play with some of the values that you're finding inside the attributes manager for each one of the objects. Once you do that, we'll continue to push this forward. I'll talk to you a little bit more about Cinema 4D and the interface and what to expect, and then we'll get started with our first project. But we'll catch up, and we'll do that in the next presentation.